Go live. Oh, kia ora, Cameron and Martin. Great to have you here to talk about this, the update on the review we've been undertaking and the workshops we've had. So I'll hand over to you. Thank you.
Excellent. Good afternoon, councillors. So we're here today to provide an update, as you can see on the screen, on the CW Zone Committee review update, on the Zone Committee review. And this builds on previous sessions we've had with you, both briefings and workshops, and the last of which was on the 12th of September, builds on workshops that we've had with some mayors and Runanga representatives, and is in advance of the Canterbury Mural Forum meeting next Friday next week, in which we'll be seeking we've got some recommendations we're taking to the Mural Forum, seeking endorsement about next steps. And so it's largely a kind of a for information briefing today. This is where we've got to. The paper for the Mural Forum has been drafted, but very happy to have a conversation, and we will be sharing these papers with you at some point as well.
Just hang on. Councillor Sunkel, if you can hear, your camera's turned on accidentally. Yeah, cool. Thank you. Maybe, yeah, all good. Thank you. There you go, Cameron.
Excellent. Okay, so take you back to the last workshop we had with you, and we tested some models, and then we also talked about taking a paper to the Mural Forum. And at the Mural Forum meeting, we proposed that they identify a number of mayors that could work with us via a small working group to further progress some of this thinking. And then following that same day at Toroputuia, there was an agreement to nominate a similar number of Runanga representatives to support this work. So we've held a couple of workshops, and we had Mayors Black, Major, Munro, Bowen and Mackle. We also had Rick Tainui and Dardanelle McLean-Smith, so Rick from Onuku and Dardanelle from down south at Waihao. And we had Chair Pooling attend, and also councillors, Ngāi Tahu councillors Cranwell and Korako. So the first workshop that we held was on principles, functions and bottom lines, and it very much mirrored the last workshop that we had with you, in which we tested these to see if we had it right, and largely focused on what do our communities need from us and what do we need from each other. And then the second workshop was on draft models. What we really emphasised and pushed with this group of mayors and Runanga representatives was being really clear on what the function is of these kind of groups moving forward, because form follows function, and once we identify what the function is, we kind of move into form. And of course, this builds on the extensive work that we carried out in the first half of this year, January through to June, which was a number of individual meetings, interviews with mayors, workshops with zone committees, and also with CW Zone Committee Runanga representatives as well, to really test kind of what had been working well with regard to zone committees, and what hadn't worked so well and what might be needed into the future. So just a quick outline of what the outcomes of that workshop were, and this is informing the Mural Forum paper that is going Friday next week. There was a lot of discussion within these workshops that the CWS vision and principles still remain very sound and are a good basis for moving forward, but there were questions around zone committee structure not being fit for purpose. But there's also a clear articulation and recognition of the heavy lifting and all the work that had been achieved from zone committees over the past 10 to 15 years, and also that some zone committees are working better than others. And I think we've talked about this previously with councillors, in that some are very keen, and I'm particularly thinking up north in Kaikoura, in which they will say that their zone committee works well and they don't want it really to be mucked around with too much. And so that's been informing our thinking as we move forward. So within those workshops, when we were testing what do we need moving forward, there was identified a preferred base model which is centred on connecting territorial authorities, mana whenua and regional council at a leadership level and at place. And this is what we heard from you as councillors as well in September. So it was really kind of confirming the thinking of this council. And then when we tested it within that working group, they came to the same conclusion. But absolutely reflecting the critical need to continue connecting with local communities, and noting that that will differ across the region, but that absolutely has to be a key component of this, along with the need that where we move forward reflects that maturing partnership with mana whenua. Also, within these workshops, it was raised around how connections are needed to central government and industry as needed. So that was another interesting point that came. What also came from these workshops is that coming together to talk or converse isn't good enough. So the relationship of the three partners has to be meaningful and purposeful. And they talked about direction setting and possibly support for funding decisions or endorsement of funding decisions or promotion of funding decisions. So Data now from further south summed this up well and far better than I'm summing it up. But she talked about the role of this group in confirming a master plan, building on existing documents such as zone implementation plans of local priorities, and then utilising collective resources, mana, and networks of those three groups to help progress action. So, as I've talked about, this is a continuation. ZIPs remain important, but there's also some conversation around, is there a need to expand scope from the CWMS is obviously focused on freshwater, land use outcomes and biodiversity, but there's also talks about whether or not to include other items such as biosecurity within there, so extending the scope, but not necessarily losing your prioritisation. There was certainly acknowledgement that the degree of regional consistency is needed, particularly when we think about that core membership and function perspective, but with, again, enough flexibility to enable local solutions, and particularly from a community engagement perspective. What that looks like will differ across Canterbury according to those local needs. Priorities might also look different across Canterbury, although still sitting within that freshwater biodiversity largely perspective, and also looking at what kind of investment might differ across the region as well to address some of those priorities. Again, there was talk about the need to be effective and efficient without duplication, and we quite often talked about some of the other groups and kind of strategies that are operating, and how would the future approach link with those or build on those. The Waikarakau catchment strategy, which this council agreed to recently, but also looking at whakaora in Whakaropo, Littleton Harbour, and looking at the mechanism that works over there in working to see how might this approach build off, leverage, or work alongside that. And then finally, support from councils and urunanga will be crucial. So this really does require a tripartite solution to move forward. Some of the key questions that need to be investigated further. So it was really good to get that guidance from the small working group, and this is some of the material that we're taking to the Mayoral Forum next week. But there are some unresolved questions that need to be refined early next year. First of all, what scale will leadership groups operate across if they are agreed to next year? There was talk about existing CWMS zones, so we've got 10 of those across Canterbury, versus district boundaries, versus freshwater management units. And so we need to do some work to understand what that looks like, how that works from a regional council versus a territorial authority versus a Runanga perspective, noting there is quite a bit of variety across Canterbury with regard to kind of the size of or the number of Runanga, for instance, that sit within a district boundary looks different across Canterbury. There was also talk that, and we need to do some further examination of how would any kind of future groups be mandated. So obviously zone committees at the moment are joint committees of councils between ourselves and the relevant territorial authority, but we know there are also MOUs in place or collaborative agreements in place, and a collaborative agreement is what supports the whakaora partnership. There were also conversations. We need to think about how will groups operate with regard to what is the role of wider membership if groups do choose to bring in wider kind of industry members or community members, what might meeting formats look like, and what are also the administrative costs associated with running these, noting that we have been working to kind of the current budget that we have associated with zone committees. And then there's a question as well, how does this work get further tested with Urunanga chairs? We're obviously taking a paper to the Mayoral Forum next week, and there's a question of how this might be also seek endorsement from Te Raputoia or a similar body. And so this is largely so the Mayoral Forum paper that is being considered Friday next week is largely seeking endorsement to us undertaking this further work and refining these some of the key points or the mechanics to support these new leadership groups. It is noting that the zone committee approach is not supported across the region. And so it is quite a fundamental decision or a recommendation there. But ultimately seeking endorsement that we as staff work with staff from territorial authorities to progress this work. And we're also seeking support from the existing or a new working group to resolve some of these questions. And so that's the working group of a number of mayors or Urunanga representatives. And then ultimately looking to have that advice go back to the Mayoral Forum following conversations with territorial authorities before mid next year. And so I've covered a number of those next steps up there already. We know the Mayoral Forum meets on a quarterly basis, and so the last meeting for this current financial year is in May 2025, so we're really targeting that. We know this does create a little bit of uncertainty for zone committees, but we're absolutely kind of encouraging or want zone committees to continue operating in the current form, delivering the great work that they're doing with communities, particularly through the action plan budget, until any new groups are established. And we'll also be providing an update to zone committee chairs following the Mayoral Forum meeting as well. So we continue to keep them up to date. They've been very useful in informing this bit of work, and will continue to do so, I'm sure. But it's given kind of the amount of effort and the commitment that they've shown to the CWMS, we are ensuring that we keep them up to date. That's that. Any questions?
The questions, I'm keen to just jump in and support what Cameron said. Look, I was involved in the 2 workshops and I've been to the Mayoral Forum a number of times on this over the last 6 months. The key thing that I think to take away is what's been reconfirmed is that those 3 key partners to the CWMS, that is territorial authorities, the regional council and Papatapu Rūnanga, that remains as the key building block of whatever we go forward with. That's sort of been agreed that those 3 parties need to stand shoulder to shoulder as we progress these issues going forward. And that's freshwater, and it could include biosecurity, natural hazard issues within catchments if we choose to go that way. So that's the key thing. And what it actually means is that if, for example, Kaikoura District Council and us and the community agree that they want to keep their current zone committee, they could, because those 3 partners are involved. So it doesn't, that allows them to carry on in that capacity if they wanted to. They can call it something different, but it allows for that, whereas other ones are able to change as long as those 3 key parties stay involved. And then the other side of it that we said, we talked about was that additives to it is, well, how do you link to catchment groups, catchment collectives, environmental sort of landscape groups that are within those catchments, industry and central government like LINZ and DOC, for example. So we think it's important that those get brought in if it makes sense in that catchment to do that. But as long as those 3 partners are there, that's the key thing. So that's sort of the model that we've envisioned, because I know from the feedback it might have been a bit abstract, but the key thing is that those 3 parties are there shoulder to shoulder and they bring the other groups towards them in those locations. But the regional consistency is those 3 partners must be there. in any. But again, the at place bit is whether that's a zone or a catchment or an FMU. That's to be fleshed out until May and then June next year. Like that's what the work's got to be done. How could that work? And a lot of talk was around, like Cam said there, about the Waitarakawa example of recent, because it's recent and it's fresh, especially for further south. They think that was a good thing, so they like that model. They like the way that everyone's come together and they're working on something together. So that was quite a lot in the conversation, as well as whakaora here. But there's other examples as well, but they were just two that we chose to reflect and go, they work well, so why wouldn't we use that energy to see how this could work going forward. Any other questions? Claire?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Cam, and thanks, Craig, for just filling in. I'm more than comfortable with the three partners being there and whatever they look like. I mean, my gut feeling is that this is just going to be zone committees reincarnated, and I don't think that's a healthy place for us to be. But then you, Craig, touched on catchment groups and things like that, and other community groups that are doing so much good work across the region. And I just think that we need to be very careful. Well, hopefully the Mayoral Forum is very careful and this group's very careful in thinking about that link, whether it's leadership or governance oversight. Because I think if it was governance oversight and we can connect in some of the information or the regulatory stuff that we would perhaps expect to see some activities on the ground, and provide guidance and maybe even money, but whatever, to all the good work that's actually happening on the ground now.
Definitely,
Claire. My
clear.
biggest fear is that if the wrong choice is made here, we're going to push a wedge in and undo a whole lot of stuff that's happening.
No, I can assure you that the mayors in particular, and I was conscious of that too. So the words we've talked about is connection to those groups and what's the connection that we can have with them. You're right, whether that's governance oversight or what. But what we did talk about is about direction that leadership group can provide, and also funding. We did talk about that. And then out to those groups that do their thing, rather than telling them what to do, it is that guidance role and connection. So it gives them a forum to come to as well, so they can seek advice as well. So that's definitely it was about not stepping on their toes, but working together. Yeah, Ian,
okay.
And then I'll come in the room. Yeah.
Craig, I think you've just. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yep.
I think you've just answer my question. I was going to ask what is the function of this new grouping that the elected councillors don't already perform. But if you're providing that link between the groups that are actually doing the work on the ground and the strategic direction of the council, then there's some variance in what's being proposed.
Yeah, that's definitely what we talked about. Yep, for sure. Anyone else?
Cool.
Deal?
I'm just wondering about the consistency. I think it mentioned in one of the slides there. Like Kaikoura wants to keep themselves as one entity. They think they're working okay there at the moment, but
they might. Yeah.
Well, they might. But they've got one council, one runanga, is it? And then
I think so. In that zone committee, I think so.
And then you go down to say OTOP, which has three councils, two runanga, and ECAN. What's the consistency in terms of how whatever might come out when you've got more than it doesn't. I'm just worried about consistency. So that it's easy, it's simple, it's what is it? Is it going to be? How do you determine boundaries and all that? I'm going straight to form, but I'm worried about consistency so that it's simple and actually has something that we can go, yeah, this is how it's made. Defendable, I think, is the word I'm looking for.
Yes, and that's, you're quite right. It's something we have to work through in the first part of next year. I guess the other example is looking at Christchurch City boundary, and I think maybe 6 different urunanga within that. So we need to articulate or kind of work through what are the options with how it might work. And I think Craig did a far better job of actually kind of articulating it simply than I did, but really thinking on those kind of like those three different kind of representatives. And yes, we have heard from Kaikoura that they want to keep something around their zone community, but that's the only we've only heard it from Kaikoura strongly, to be honest, So we'll be articulating what that might look like, or providing some options back into this council and back into the Mural Forum as well, along with some of the all of the territorial authorities in the first half of next year about what they'd like to see come from this, and we'll kind of work through those options next year.
Well, one more question I had is has the conversations in those workshops with the Mural Forum and with Ruranga talked much about monitoring? I think monitoring the monitoring and compliance frameworks and the work that we do, and keeping that feedback loop about what's happening on the ground in those local areas, and then understanding what the issues are, and then bringing those back up. Is that something? Because I think that's a gap that I'm seeing. Has that been talked about in those spaces?
I think it was talked briefly about, and in one of the slides we talked about whether or not these groups could set some of those priorities and what they, as a group of three, want to achieve, and then using those networks, providing the advice back into a council such as this, and then it would be up to us to say, well, this is, these are the bits of work that we have that might focus on that issue, but also providing, and I think it comes back to Claire's point around governance oversight and whether or not there's an ability to track progress and kind of report back into those leadership groups about how we are responding to particular priorities within that area.
Vicky?
Yeah, well, just in terms of feedback from that I met with Pauline Cotter last week before, to talk about urban rivers, and she was really clear that she felt that Christchurch Westmelton worked really well as it was, and that unfortunately members are sliding off the membership because of not being able to refresh and that type of thing. And she was really concerned about the time scale to May 2025. So I don't know what's being fed through the mayoral forum in terms of Christchurch Westmelton's position, but I then also talked to one of the members that they have, I think the deputy chair, Mike Patchett, who feels like certainly felt like, he wanted, I reassured him that I think we are going to continue with something that keeps that connection with Runanga and the council, with the ECAN and local council, which he certainly saw value in. In terms of, so my sense of things, I sort of been to Christchurch Westmelton, Banks Peninsula and the Selwyn Waihora zone. And so my sense is certainly that where you have membership that are connected out to on the ground action groups, so thinking particularly Christchurch and Banks Peninsula, that does help to generate that sort of like information up and information back, actually sort of helping to steer what happens, help us think about, have the connections, so on. So I think that if out in the more rural areas, that might be the catchment collectives and catchment groups, but having that sort of focus on the membership, if it's possible to, I don't know how you force that, because we get the applications we get, but that connecting into people who have already got those wider networks is really helpful. Yep. Personally, and I don't know if you really asked me this, but the FMUs to me makes a lot of sense in that we've got district councils that have their boundaries on braided rivers, which means that they sort of fall outside of anybody's particular, they're sort of between two places. So the sort of concept of having some unit that covers a big catchment, and then you've got your various sub-catchments, and certainly that's, having gone to Onuku for their discussion around looking at a catchment like a whakaora type of plan and looking at sub-catchments and working in that context, that works. I think people can understand how that goes, and you can feed in, and that would then of course bring in different councils into one one grouping, which we do have, but like I can see the complexity of it, and you've got to then align things and bring in those multiple councils, but it also gives a great opportunity where you're actually seeing, and like we've got it now with the Waitaki, where going, actually we sort of need to know what we're all doing across both sides of this river. It doesn't make sense not to. So I think there's some great opportunities in there, but it's concerning how long it's taking to come back to being. I hope that we don't lose momentum in the slowness of this process.
I mean, I think, we do have some clear dates that by the end of this financial year, that's the decision will be made and new things will be implemented. So that's pretty good, I reckon, in terms of being clarity on it. But of course, we have to seek that from the Mayoral Forum next week to see if they'll allow us to do this next piece of work. Because at the moment, we don't have a landed model that people can pick up tomorrow and run with. So there does need to be some more work. So I'm assuming the mayors will agree with that, especially because we've had 5 of them involved in the process and they were all pretty on board with it. But you never know. And I think we did talk about the at place bit a little bit. We didn't go into it too much, but we did talk about it, especially in the small group that I was in. And I've always advocated to them about the FMUs because I think the work we have done in the draft RPS is pretty good in terms of making a logical way to break up the region based on catchments or a collective of catchments where that makes sense to. And there was a bit of agreement to that, but obviously that was just in a conversation. So there's a bit more to work through, and obviously that's what the team will have to do and figure that out. And if people know about the CWMS, when that was discussed previously, it became tricky because the zones really were based on district council boundaries because that was found to be easier at that time. But I think hopefully we've moved on a bit and the catchment approach will make sense or the FMU approach will make sense. But hey, that's what the team will have to do after next week if we get that agreement to flesh that out. I've got John online, but Grant, and then I'll go to you, John. Yep, so Grant, and then go to David after that. Where you go, Grant?
Sorry. I think the direction you're going is really, really good. I like the idea of those 3 key components because they're the people who have the data and the information sharing, all that sort of stuff. And I like the idea of your use of the word connections because that's really important. One of the key things will be about how that whole sense of place is managed in project management or project coordinator that can actually assist communities and coordinate with those 3 main parties to arrive at some key goals, which might actually already be in place through the zippers and all that sort of thing, or some other thing. Have a look at the targets and then work out some actions and priority setting that you can apply money to, that you have a project that can be managed, monitored and scope within timeframes. So it's a deliverable outcome, and whether it's across multiple years or whatever, that doesn't matter too much. But it's keeping the momentum going because a lot of these projects, especially the biodiversity, even biosecurity, it takes years to from the start to even beginning. 5 years before you can see a tree coming up that's planted this high, and it's it's in your line of sight. And wilding pines, that's a different scale of landscape. So I think if you have a really good coordinator between all of these groups, that brings in the idea of the freshwater management unit, which in itself will have multiple subcatchments that people relate to. So it's a sense of place, and you might find within a subcatchment that there are already people working away doing things in their own little river, their own tributary, their own bit of bush, whatever. So you kind of connect up with them. And I think it's really good. So I mean, I think if you can carry on working the word zone committee, there's obviously some difference of opinion about the use of the word zone committee. And it's what's another name that hasn't got the connotations of what it was before. It doesn't bother me because I kind of relate to it, but it seems to bother some people
I don't think they'll be called zone committees.
No.
So don't worry about that. I think in terms of your point there about coordination, I think the team has put down about the administration of it. I mean, I think in terms of coordination, it's a bit like what Vicky said and what Claire said too, is that we already do have groups in our communities that have risen up that already do that function. So we don't need to replicate that. We just need to support it. And I think that's what the leadership group is aimed at, is connecting to them, but not necessarily doing their job for them, but connecting to them and supporting them. That could just be through funding. You don't necessarily need to replicate another layer of bureaucracy. It's about supporting them to carry on doing their good stuff, because there's already groups in some of these. They're not everywhere,
No.
but that would be the goal, is to try to help the communities form those things themselves rather than step over the top of them. So I think just so administration is important, because we need to administrate the leadership groups and the connection model, but coordination is an interesting point, and we just need to remember that it already exists in some of these communities, and we don't need to replicate it.
The reason why Kaikoura people feel it was really successful was that there was a Environment Canterbury management team there who had a person who
and that works for them, and that could continue to work, Grant, but it might not work everywhere.
But unless you have some coordination, when I say coordination, I mean unless you have somebody who's looking at at some of the issues and can actually assist in managing that, or managing the managers or whatever, as an oversight.
Yeah.
I think it's really...
And I think that's what we think needs to come from the local flavour of each. Like, the regional consistency is that the leadership group is established, but the local flavour might be, does this group need a coordinator because there's nothing exists in the community or not? So that'll be up to that local decision making when we get to that. So that's what I think these guys are going to have to flesh out, is how does that work? What's the baseline you need to set this up? And then what can you add to it? And those adding to it will be the local decisions that will be made once you've got the structure in place. That's what I believe. So I'm not saying it won't happen, the coordination stuff, but it will happen where that it makes sense to in that local catchment or FMU or whatever we go forward with. So, yeah, but it might not be blanket, everyone needs to have a coordinator. See what I mean? So it's just got to be a bit nuanced. Yeah. John?
Thanks, Craig. I think you've articulated the challenges that I initially thought about, just creating another bureaucracy to do stuff. So, but the way you've articulated that connection, maybe some of the administration, some of the coordination for particularly those groups that are out there and active at the moment, they have their mandates, they have their authorities, they have their ownership. So, yeah, I would definitely not like to see a group come in over the top and then try and dictate or whatever. So the way you've explained it gives me some confidence as to how it all might come together. Everyone else has spoken to it, so that's probably all I have to say. Thank you.
Thanks, John. David?
Thanks for the work that's been progressed so far. I'm a great fan, having sort of worked in the old North Canterbury Catchment Board days, of focusing on a catchment. There are 6 major rivers within the ECAN area, and probably half a dozen smaller ones, second tier, and then Banks Peninsula. So, I like the idea of focusing on a particular catchment, mainly for water issues. I think there will be some cross-pollination when it comes to biodiversity and biosecurity that would be difficult to just fit into one model. There will be an overlap there, but I take the point that there are a lot of organisations that are already up and running and working well. And we don't want too much of an overlay over the top, but definitely I think focusing on the major catchments of our area is the way to go.
Thanks, David. And lastly, Ian, or have you got another one, Ian? But Ian, you go first.
No, thanks. Thanks, Craig. Me? Yeah. Grant and you touched on a subject which I was toying around with in my head, and that is about where the local community gets on and tries to run a project. I'm thinking in this case the management to recharge project in Hinds with the support of the regional council, and then the regional council pulled its support and has done everything it can to frustrate progress on that progress. So on that program, so that ECAN needs to get behind. There's no point in having. It doesn't matter what the structure you have in place to replace zoning committees. If ECAN has flip flops on direction and policy and what it wants to support and what it doesn't want to support, because that's a great way of turning off any community involvement. And I have to say that's one of the challenges that ECAN's now got in the Ashburton district is to re-establish some level of credibility for where it sits on actually working on a catchment level to sort out some of the issues we've got. So that we need some A, consistency, and B, support for what the locals want to do, rather than say, oh, we don't like what you want to do anymore, we're not going to support you.
Yeah, I think the trick will be, Ian, is that those things will happen when those three key partners agree, and then things will happen. I think that's what we're trying to get at, that when there's divergence that's become difficult. So the idea is that we that's why I think everyone, including the mayors, agreed that a leadership forum, or a forum where those three partners can still work together and then connect to their communities, the catchment collectives, the catchment groups, industry, central government, in their place. That's what's important. So that's been a really strong message, and that's been good to get that confirmation.
Yeah, and look, we had that three-level support from the Runanga, the district and the regional council, and then one party, the Runanga, pulled out of the support, and so the regional council then pulled out of support. Well, that doesn't rub particularly well with the community, where they're getting rated to implement the project and to the tune of around $2 million a year. So, you've got to have some sort of disciplines around those protocols, I guess, is what I'm trying to argue for, so that you can't turn off and on support just because somebody had a bad dream or something.
I think that happens every term of government and every term of council, but I get it. I mean, that's going to have to be how the partnership goes forward amongst the groups, and hopefully if they're all connected, that can happen. But things can change, of course. So, Dion, do you have another question?
Yeah, thanks.
Sorry.
I just don't need to answer it now, but one thing that I think I want to understand when we come back to this is what is the actual function going to look like? I still don't really feel like I understand the function. Like, are they going to be decision-making bodies? Are they going to just be partnerships? Are they just leaderships or advisory? What are the existing work programs that these things that they may be able to pick up? I still have a little bit of I don't understand the function. I'm sorry. So I'm still sitting on the fence about what we do, or whether we even sort of continue the support on them, because I don't understand their function.
I think that's a really good question, Dion, and it's something I've said to the team over time and we haven't gone there because it's a bit too technical. But of course, and when I was talking to the mayors and the Runanga chairs that were involved, we all have, particularly TLAs and us, have statutory functions that we must fulfil. And Runanga have some to some degree through Ngāi Tahu Settlement Act and all that sort of stuff. So there is some statutory roles there that they do have. And I have suggested to the team that we actually write them down and put them, the three different functions of our different groups, and then try to see where is their connection between them, where it makes sense for us to work together with some of those functions. Because sometimes, as you know, they overlap, or they're complementary, or sometimes they could be a bit in conflict, but that's where we need to work together. So I think we'll get that in some detail when we say these are the functions that these groups can help us with. They might not be the actual body that has the responsibility, because that'll be each partner themselves, but it makes sense to do it together. And I gave the example to Mayor Major that, we all have to go out and consult with our communities every year on certain things, but if we had a forum where we could do it together, we could save time and money. We could. I just said we could, because I don't, until we flesh it out, we won't know. And he was, taken by that and thought, yeah, true, we could. There is some efficiencies that could be gained if we did things together, not separately, especially around an issue like biodiversity, for example, where they've got some responsibilities and we have some responsibilities. Why wouldn't we do that together in a joint forum? That's the point. So I think hopefully we can see that, and hopefully what the work we'll do till May is flesh some of them out, so there are actual functions that those leadership groups could help fulfill, even if they won't totally dissolve them, but they can help fulfill them. Yeah, make sense? I mean, we're working in a space where we'll have a think about what we've had the signal from government too about potential RMA changes, and that there's still a thought that we will get into spatial planning and doing it across the region. Yeah. So these bodies may help us move towards that in the future. Anyway, you never know, because we have to work together. Yeah. You sure you want to go there, Grant?
I'm kind of thinking, what you're saying is about how things can mature. It's just the case of the question at the moment in Waimakariri, Kaiapoi River. We had the zone implementation plan. That was effectively, in terms of the non-statutory stuff, was supposed to be Environment Canterbury, kind of a little bit, but not much. Lack of coordination with the district council. They then set up a land and water committee, and one of the goals of that committee was to implement the non-statutory part of the zipper. Then at the side, we all had a zone committee, and there's kind of the disconnection between everybody, and then the disconnection between that and the community. And so, like, how do you, like, who it was like, where does the community go? And so that was an incredibly disjointed community, multiple projects, everybody wanted to do this, and you had multiple little community groups all saying, I want to do this, this isn't working, what are you doing about this? So the blame game then sets in. So it's kind of like you're saying, is what is the mechanism to actually keep this thing going so that you can deliver something, and everybody, the communication between everybody is really important.
Yeah, look, and we might not be able to solve everything, but the thing is, we've had a clear message that across universally, the zone committees aren't fit for purpose anymore. So that's what we're trying to solve, that problem at the moment. But there are other ones. But I think, yeah, there's some good agreement at the moment amongst the people that have been involved, and I think there's some good work to do. So, kia ora everybody. Thanks, guys. Good feedback, and thank you. And I'll let you know how the Mural Forum goes. And I think just because we had there's a couple of emails floating around KT about visibility for the councillors of the Mural Forum agendas and stuff. So I'm sure we can do that, and that'll be important so you guys can keep up with it. But I will also keep you informed of what's happening. Cool. And at the next meeting, just so everyone knows, for us, the zone committee paper, and we're also doing a biodiversity champions paper. So they are the two ones that we're leading on the day from our point of view. All good? Thank you.